In the halls of Somerton High, where trophies gleamed and traditions ran deep, a silent storm was brewing. Rachel Dawson, once a vibrant black student, now moved through her days like a fading shadow. Her father John, ever the problem solver, watched helplessly as his daughter withdrew further into herself. Until one day, everything changed when John found Rachel huddled on the floor of the school bathroom, her sobs echoing off the cold tiles. In that moment, the shocking truth came pouring out, a revelation of the injustice that had been happening to his innocent daughter all along. What dark secret had been lurking in the corridors of Somerton High, and what hardships did this young black girl have to endure in silence? Before we dive in, comment below where you're watching or listening from today. And if you enjoy this shocking story, don't forget to subscribe. The rhythmic tapping of John's pen on his legal pad echoed through the unusually quiet Dawson living room. He sat in his favorite armchair, his brow furrowed in concentration as he reviewed some work documents. It was unusual for him to be home this early, but a nagging feeling had prompted him to leave the office sooner than usual. The sound of a key turning in the lock drew his attention. The door swung open, revealing his daughter, Rachel. John's heart skipped a beat as he took in her appearance. Rachel's eyes, usually bright and full of life, were red and puffy. It was clear she had been crying. "Rachel." John's voice was gentle, but there was an undercurrent of concern. "What happened at school today?" Rachel's gaze darted around the room, refusing to meet her father's eyes. "Nothing, Dad," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The words came out too quickly, too rehearsed. John felt a knot form in his stomach. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. He'd always prided himself on the open relationship he had with his daughter. Rachel had never been one to keep secrets, and her sudden reticence set off alarm bells in his mind. He watched helplessly as Rachel trudged up the stairs, her backpack hanging limply from one shoulder. The sound of her bedroom door closing echoed through the house, leaving John in a sea of worried thoughts. Marie, John's wife, emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She had overheard the brief exchange and saw the concern etched on her husband's face. "What's wrong?" she asked, settling onto the arm of John's chair. John ran a hand through his hair, a habit he'd developed when stressed. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "Rachel seems upset, but she won't talk to me about it. It's not like her to be so closed off." Marie's brow furrowed in thought. "Maybe it's just a disagreement with a friend," she suggested, trying to ease John's worry. "Or a bad grade on a test. You know how seriously she takes her studies." John nodded slowly, but the knot in his stomach refused to loosen. "Maybe," he conceded, "but my gut tells me it's something more." Marie placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Let's give her some space," she advised. "If it's something serious, she'll come to us when she's ready. We've always encouraged her to be open with us, and that trust goes both ways." John nodded, trying to convince himself that Marie was right. But as the evening wore on, he couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had shifted in their family dynamic. The usual warmth and laughter that filled their home seemed muted, overshadowed by the weight of unspoken words. As night fell, the aroma of Marie's homemade lasagna wafted through the Dawson household, a comforting scent that usually brought the family together with eager anticipation. Tonight, however, there was an undercurrent of tension that even the most delicious meal couldn't fully dispel. John sat at the head of the table, his eyes frequently darting to Rachel's empty chair. When she finally appeared in the doorway, he noticed the slight hesitation in her step, the way her eyes seemed to avoid direct contact with either of her parents. "Perfect timing, sweetheart," Marie said, her voice deliberately light as she set the steaming dish on the table. "I was just about to call you down." Rachel slid into her seat, mumbling a quiet thanks, as her mother served her a generous portion. John exchanged a quick glance with Marie, a silent communication passing between them. They had agreed to approach the subject carefully, to create a safe space for Rachel to open up if she wanted to. As they began to eat, John cleared his throat, aiming for a casual tone. "So, Rachel, how was school today? Anything interesting happen?" Rachel pushed a piece of lasagna around her plate, her fork scraping against the ceramic. "It was fine," she replied, her voice lacking its usual energy. "Just a normal day." John pressed on, keeping his tone light. "Any fun projects coming up? I remember you mentioning a big presentation in your history class." For a moment, Rachel's hand stilled, and John thought he saw a flicker of something in her eyes. But as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. "No, not really," she said, still not meeting his gaze. "Everything's fine, Dad. Can we just eat?" The tension at the table was palpable. Marie jumped in, trying to steer the conversation to safer waters. "I was thinking we could go to the farmer's market this weekend," she suggested. "Maybe pick up some fresh vegetables, make a day of it. What do you think, Rachel?" Rachel shrugged, her shoulders hunched as if trying to make herself smaller. "I don't know. Maybe." The rest of the meal passed in uncomfortable silence, broken only by the clink of cutlery against plates and Marie's occasional attempts at small talk. John felt his frustration growing with each passing minute. He wanted to shake Rachel, to demand that she tell them what was wrong. But he knew that approach would only push her further away. As Rachel excused herself from the table, disappearing back upstairs, John and Marie shared a look of helpless concern. "Something's definitely wrong," John said once they were alone, his voice low and worried. "I've never seen her like this before. It's like she's, I don't know, shutting down." Marie began clearing the table, her movements betraying her own anxiety. "I know," she sighed, "but we can't force her to talk if she's not ready. Maybe it's just a phase. You know how teenagers can be." John shook his head, unconvinced. "This feels different, Marie. It's not just typical teenage moodiness. Something's happened. I can feel it." They spent the next hour discussing potential causes for Rachel's behavior, theories ranging from bullying to boy troubles to academic stress. But none of their speculations felt quite right, and they were left with more questions than answers. As they prepared for bed that night, the atmosphere in the Dawson household was thick with unspoken fears and unanswered questions. John and Marie clung to each other, drawing strength from their shared love for their daughter and their determination to protect her no matter what. But as John drifted into an uneasy sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of something big, something that would test their family in ways they had never imagined. The truth, when it finally came out, would shake their world to its very foundations. The next day, John found it difficult to concentrate at work. His mind kept drifting back to Rachel's behavior the previous evening, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. By early afternoon, his worry had intensified to the point where he decided to leave the office early. As he drove home, John's eyes kept flicking to the clock on the dashboard. Rachel was usually home by 3:30 p.m., her punctuality a point of pride. But as he pulled into the driveway at 3:15 p.m., he realized he'd be able to be there when she arrived. Perhaps, he thought, he'd have a chance to talk to her one-on-one before Marie got home from her shift. John settled into his armchair in the living room, pretending to read a book while he waited. The minutes ticked by slowly. 3:30 p.m. came and went, then 4 p.m. By 4:30 p.m., John's anxiety had skyrocketed. He was about to call the school when he finally heard the sound of a key in the lock. At 4:45 p.m., Rachel walked through the door. John was on his feet in an instant, relief at seeing her quickly giving way to renewed concern. Rachel looked even worse than she had the day before. Her hair, usually neatly braided, was disheveled, as if she'd been running her hands through it repeatedly. Her eyes were red-rimmed and puffy, clear evidence of recent tears. But it was the absence of her backpack that truly alarmed John. Rachel was meticulous about her schoolwork. The missing bag spoke volumes about her state of mind. "Rachel," John said, his voice a mix of relief and worry. "Where have you been? I was worried sick." Rachel wouldn't meet his eyes, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere over his shoulder. I'm sorry I'm late," she mumbled, her voice barely audible. John took a deep breath, trying to keep his growing frustration in check. "What happened? And where's your backpack? At the mention of her backpack, Rachel's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of panic crossing her face. I must have left it at school, she stammered, the lie painfully obvious. John felt his patience wearing thin. Something was very wrong, and Rachel's continued evasiveness was only heightening his concern. "Rachel, please," he said, his voice taking on an edge of desperation. "Is someone bullying you at school? You can tell me if something's wrong. I'm here to help you." Rachel's lower lip trembled, and for a moment John thought she might finally open up. But then she shook her head vehemently. "No, Dad. Everything's fine. I don't want to talk about it, okay?" The tension in the room was palpable. John opened his mouth to press further, but Marie's gentle hand on his arm stopped him. She had emerged from the kitchen, drawn by the sound of their voices. "Rachel, honey," Marie said softly, "we're just worried about you. If something's happening at school or anywhere else, we want to help. You know you can tell us anything, right?" Rachel's eyes darted between her parents, a mix of emotions playing across her face. For a brief moment, it seemed like she might break down and confide in them. But then, as quickly as it had appeared, the vulnerability vanished, replaced by a mask of forced calm. "I know," she said, her voice steadier now, "but really everything's fine. I'm just tired. Can I go to my room now?" John and Marie exchanged a helpless look. They both knew pushing harder right now would only cause Rachel to retreat further. With a heavy sigh, John nodded. "All right," he said, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "But Rachel, we're here for you, always, remember that." As Rachel climbed the stairs, her footsteps heavy and slow, John felt a surge of frustration and fear. He turned to Marie, his eyes reflecting the turmoil in his heart. "We can't just let this go," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Something is seriously wrong, Marie. I can feel it." Marie nodded, her own worry evident in the lines creasing her forehead. "I know," she agreed. "But we can't force her to talk. We need to be patient, give her space to come to us when she's ready." John ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that betrayed his agitation. "And what if she doesn't? What if whatever's happening gets worse while we're sitting here doing nothing?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither wanted to voice. As the evening wore on, the Dawson household was shrouded in a tense silence, broken only by the muffled sounds of Rachel's music drifting down from upstairs. Later that night, as John lay awake in bed, his mind racing with possibilities and fears, a thought began to form. It was a desperate move, one that went against his better judgment. But as he considered the pain in Rachel's eyes, the fear in her voice, he knew he had to do something. Anything. He reached for his phone on the bedside table. He had a call to make, one that he hoped would provide some answers. With a deep breath, John dialed Mr. Fletcher's number. The school had provided it for emergencies, and while this might not fit the traditional definition, John couldn't shake the feeling that his daughter was in some kind of danger. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. John's finger hovered over the end call button, doubt creeping in. Just as he was about to hang up, a voice answered, flat and unwelcoming. "Hello?" Mr. Fletcher's tone held a note of irritation, likely at being disturbed so late. John cleared his throat, suddenly feeling foolish. "Mr. Fletcher, this is John Dawson, Rachel's father. I'm sorry to call so late, but I needed to ask you something." There was a pause on the other end, long enough for John to wonder if the call had dropped. Then Mr. Fletcher spoke again, his voice carefully neutral. "What can I do for you, Mr. Dawson?" John hesitated, unsure how to phrase his concerns without sounding accusatory. I was wondering if something happened at school today, or recently. Rachel came home very upset and she's been different lately. I thought maybe you might have noticed something." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. John could hear his own heartbeat, loud in his ears. When Mr. Fletcher finally responded, his tone was casual, almost dismissive. "Nothing happened today, Mr. Dawson. Everything was perfectly normal." John felt a mix of relief and frustration. Part of him had hoped for an easy explanation, a simple misunderstanding that could be cleared up. But Mr. Fletcher's words did nothing to explain Rachel's behavior. "Are you sure?" John pressed, unable to let it go. "She hasn't seemed herself lately. I thought maybe there might be some issues with other students or—" Mr. Fletcher cut him off, his voice suddenly cold. "Mr. Dawson, it's late. I don't think it's appropriate to call me at this hour about something like this. I'm a teacher, not a therapist." The abrupt shift in tone caught John off guard. He opened his mouth to apologize, to explain his desperation, but Mr. Fletcher continued before he could speak. "I have to go. Good night, Mr. Dawson." The line went dead, leaving John sitting in stunned silence, the phone still pressed to his ear. He lowered it slowly, staring at the dark screen as if it might offer some explanation for the bizarre conversation. Something about Mr. Fletcher's reaction felt off. The casual dismissal of his concerns, followed by the sudden coldness. It didn't sit right with John. But what did it mean? Was he reading too much into a simple late-night call? As John made his way back to bed, his mind whirled with new questions. He had hoped the call would provide some clarity, some insight into Rachel's behavior. Instead, he felt more confused than ever. Slipping under the covers beside Marie, John tried to make sense of it all. Mr. Fletcher had said nothing happened, that everything was normal. But if that was true, why was Rachel so upset? And why did Mr. Fletcher react so strongly to his questions? Sleep eluded John that night, his mind a whirlwind of worry and confusion after the unsettling call with Mr. Fletcher. As the first rays of dawn crept through the curtains, he found himself in the kitchen, mechanically brewing a pot of coffee. The house was quiet, save for the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of settling floorboards. Marie joined him soon after, her face etched with concern as she took in John's haggard appearance. "You look like you haven't slept a wink," she said softly, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. John sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I couldn't. That call with Mr. Fletcher. Something's not right, Marie. I can feel it in my bones." As they sat at the kitchen table, steaming mugs of coffee warming their hands, John recounted the late-night conversation. Marie listened intently, her brow furrowing deeper with each detail. "It doesn't make sense," she said finally, shaking her head. "If nothing happened, why would he be so defensive?" John leaned back in his chair, his expression troubled. "I don't know. But there's something else I've been thinking about, something that's been nagging at me." Marie looked at him expectantly, waiting for him to continue. "What if—" John paused, struggling to voice the thought that had been lurking in the back of his mind. "What if this is about race?" The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Marie's eyes widened as she considered the possibility. "You think Rachel's being bullied because she's black?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John shrugged helplessly. "I don't know, but we've heard about these things happening in schools, haven't we? Subtle forms of racism, microaggressions. What if that's what's going on here?" Marie shook her head, not quite ready to accept this theory. "But Rachel's never had problems like this before. She's always gotten along well with the other kids." "I know," John conceded, "but something's changed. You've seen how she's been acting. The crying, the secrecy. It has to be something serious." Marie stood up, pacing the kitchen as she thought. "But if it were bullying, wouldn't she have told us? We've always encouraged her to come to us if anything like that happened." John leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "Maybe she's ashamed, or scared. You know how kids can be, especially at her age. She might think she needs to handle it on her own." They fell into silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The possibility that their daughter might be facing racism at school was a painful one to consider. They had always hoped that Rachel would be spared such experiences, at least for a while longer. "We need to talk to her again," Marie said finally, her voice firm. "We need to let her know that whatever's happening, we're here for her, that she can trust us." John nodded in agreement, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than they were seeing. The memory of Mr. Fletcher's cold dismissal on the phone nagged at him, a piece of the puzzle that didn't quite fit. As the day wore on, John and Marie went about their routines, but their minds were elsewhere. They exchanged worried glances whenever Rachel was out of sight, their concern growing with each passing hour. That evening, as they prepared dinner together, John and Marie continued to discuss their options in hushed tones. They debated whether to confront Rachel directly, to reach out to the school again, or to wait and see if she would open up on her own. The atmosphere in the Dawson household was thick with unspoken fears and unanswered questions. As they sat down to eat, the usual warmth of their family dinners was overshadowed by the weight of their shared worry for Rachel. John couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of something big, something that would test their family in ways they had never imagined. The truth, when it finally came out, would shake their world to its very foundations. But for now, all they could do was be there for Rachel, ready to support her whenever she was ready to break her silence. The next day dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the dark clouds of worry that hung over the Dawson family. John went through his morning routine mechanically, his mind preoccupied with thoughts of Rachel and the growing mystery surrounding her behavior. As he sat in an important meeting at work, John found it nearly impossible to focus. His colleagues' voices faded into a dull buzz as he stared unseeing at the presentation on the screen, his thoughts miles away in a high school classroom where his daughter sat even now. Suddenly, a sharp vibration in his pocket jolted him back to the present. John's heart leapt into his throat as he saw Rachel's name on the caller ID. She never called during school hours. Something was wrong. Muttering a hurried excuse, John all but ran from the conference room, ignoring the startled looks of his colleagues. Once in the hallway, he answered the call, his voice tight with worry. "Rachel, what's wrong?" The sound that came through the phone made his blood run cold. Rachel was crying, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "Daddy," she sobbed, her voice barely audible. "I'm in the bathroom. I need you to come." John's mind raced, 1,000 terrible scenarios flashing through his head. "Rachel, sweetheart, calm down. Tell me what happened. Are you hurt?" Another sob was his only answer. In the background, John could hear the echo of the school bathroom, the occasional sound of a distant voice or locker slamming shut. "I'm coming right now," John said, already moving towards the elevator. "Stay where you are, okay? I'll be there as fast as I can." As he ended the call, John's hands were shaking so badly he could barely press the elevator button. The ride down to the parking garage felt like an eternity, each second stretching out unbearably as he imagined what could have driven Rachel to such a state. The drive to the school was a blur. John barely registered the other cars on the road, his entire being focused on getting to his daughter. He ran every red light, silently praying that no police officer would choose this moment to enforce traffic laws. As he screeched into the school parking lot, John's mind was in turmoil. What would he find when he got to Rachel? Was she hurt? Scared? Had something happened with other students? Or was it something else entirely? The memory of his conversation with Mr. Fletcher flashed through his mind. The teacher's dismissive tone, his insistence that everything was fine. Had he missed something? Had they all missed something crucial? John burst through the school doors, ignoring the startled look from the receptionist. He knew where the girls' bathrooms were from previous school events, and he made a beeline for them now, his heart pounding in his ears. As he approached the bathroom door, John hesitated for a split second. This was the girls' bathroom, after all. But the sound of muffled sobbing from inside steeled his resolve. His daughter needed him, propriety be damned. "Rachel," he called out as he pushed the door open. "Rachel, I'm here." The sobbing grew louder, coming from the last stall. John approached slowly, his footsteps echoing in the tiled room. "Rachel, sweetheart, it's Dad. Can you open the door?" There was a moment of silence, then the sound of a lock sliding back. The stall door creaked open, revealing Rachel huddled on the floor, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. John's heart broke at the sight. He knelt down beside her, gathering her into his arms as she began to cry anew. "It's okay," he murmured, stroking her hair. "I'm here now. You're safe." As he held his trembling daughter, John's mind raced. What could have happened to reduce Rachel, his strong, confident girl, to this state? And more importantly, what was he going to do about it? One thing was certain. He wasn't leaving this school until he got some answers. The time for politeness and patience was over. Whatever was going on, whatever had hurt his little girl, John was determined to get to the bottom of it. As Rachel's sobs began to subside, John steeled himself for what was to come. He had a feeling that the truth, when it finally came out, would change everything. But he was ready. For Rachel, he would face anything. The girls' bathroom at Somerton High School had never felt so small. John Dawson knelt on the cold tile floor, his arms wrapped protectively around Rachel, who continued to tremble in his embrace. The harsh fluorescent lights cast unflattering shadows, highlighting the tear tracks on Rachel's face and the worry lines etched deep in John's forehead. "Rachel," John said softly, gently pulling back to look at his daughter's face, "can you tell me what happened? Why are you hiding in here?" Rachel's eyes, red-rimmed and puffy, darted around the bathroom as if expecting danger to materialize from the shadows. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, a fresh wave of tears spilled down her cheeks. John's heart clenched at the sight. He had never seen his daughter so distraught, so broken. It took every ounce of his self-control not to storm out of the bathroom and demand answers from every teacher and student in the building. "It's okay," he soothed, his voice low and calm despite the turmoil in his heart. "You're safe now. I'm here. And I won't let anything happen to you. Can you tell me what's going on?" Rachel took a shuddering breath, her fingers twisting the hem of her shirt. I can't go back there, Dad," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. "Back where, sweetheart?" John prompted gently, his mind racing with possibilities, each more alarming than the last. "To class," Rachel choked out. To him." A chill ran down John's spine. "Him? Who do you mean, Rachel?" Rachel's eyes squeezed shut as if blocking out a painful memory. "Mr. Fletcher," she said, the name barely audible. The pieces began to fall into place in John's mind. Rachel's recent behavior, Mr. Fletcher's strange reaction to his phone call. A surge of anger rose in his chest, but he forced it down. Right now, Rachel needed him to be calm and supportive. "What about Mr. Fletcher?" John asked, keeping his voice steady. "Has he done something to you?" Rachel nodded, a small, jerky movement. He's been... She trailed off, struggling to find the words. "It's okay," John reassured her. "Take your time, I'm listening." Rachel took a deep breath, seeming to draw strength from her father's presence. "He's been treating me differently," she said finally. "Making comments about my race, excluding me from group activities, making me stay late for no reason." John felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. His suspicions about racial bullying had been right, but he'd never imagined it would come from a teacher. "How long has this been going on?" he asked, dreading the answer. "A few weeks," Rachel admitted, her voice small. "At first I thought maybe I was imagining it, but it kept getting worse, and today—" Her voice broke, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "What happened today?" John prompted gently, his arm tightening around her shoulders. Rachel swallowed hard. "We had a presentation. I was at the board and I used white chalk to draw a diagram. Mr. Fletcher, he said the white chalk might be helpful for me in other ways too. The whole class laughed. I couldn't stay there anymore." The blatant racism of the comment made John's blood boil. He wanted to march straight to the principal's office, to confront Mr. Fletcher, to demand justice for his daughter. But one look at Rachel's tear-stained face reminded him that she needed him here now. "I'm so sorry you've been going through this alone," John said, his voice thick with emotion. "But you're not alone anymore. We're going to fix this, Rachel. I promise you." Rachel looked up at him, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "How?" John stood up, offering his hand to help Rachel to her feet. "First, We're going to get you out of this bathroom. Then we're going to have a talk with the principal. This ends today." As they walked out of the bathroom, John's arm protectively around Rachel's shoulders, he felt a mix of emotions: anger at Mr. Fletcher, guilt for not realizing sooner what was happening, and determination to make things right. The hallway was mercifully empty as they made their way to the principal's office. John could feel Rachel tensing with each step, and he gave her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "It's going to be okay," he murmured. "I'm right here with you." As they approached the principal's office, John steeled himself for the confrontation to come. He knew this was just the beginning of what would likely be a difficult and emotional process, but looking at Rachel, seeing the relief in her eyes at finally sharing her burden, he knew it was worth it. The principal's office was a stark contrast to the emotional turmoil of the bathroom scene. Principal Harris, a woman in her mid-50s with graying hair and kind eyes, listened intently as Rachel, with John's supportive presence beside her, recounted the events of the past few weeks. As Rachel spoke, her voice growing stronger with each word, John felt a mix of pride in his daughter's courage and a deep, simmering anger at what she had endured. Principal Harris's expression grew increasingly grave as the story unfolded. "Rachel," the principal said gently when the girl had finished speaking, "I want you to know how brave you are for coming forward. What Mr. Fletcher has done is completely unacceptable." John, who had been silent throughout Rachel's account, finally spoke up. "What's going to be done about this?" he asked, his voice tight with barely contained fury. Principal Harris held up a hand, her expression serious. "Mr. Dawson, I assure you we take these allegations very seriously. We have a zero-tolerance policy for any form of discrimination or harassment. I'm going to ask you both to wait here while I speak with Mr. Fletcher." As the principal left the office, John turned to Rachel, who seemed both relieved and anxious. "You did great, sweetheart," he said softly. "I'm so proud of you." Rachel managed a small smile, the first John had seen in days. "Thanks, Dad," she whispered. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner." John shook his head, taking her hand in his. "You have nothing to be sorry for. This was not your fault, not at all." They sat in silence for several minutes, the ticking of the clock on the wall marking the passage of time. John's mind raced with questions and concerns. How long had this really been going on? Were there other students experiencing similar treatment? And most pressingly, how had a teacher like Mr. Fletcher been allowed to behave this way for so long? The door opened, and Principal Harris returned, her face a mask of professional calm. "Mr. Dawson, Rachel, I've spoken with Mr. Fletcher. He's waiting in his classroom. I think it would be best if we all spoke together. Are you comfortable with that, Rachel?" Rachel hesitated, looking to her father for guidance. John squeezed her hand reassuringly. "It's up to you, sweetheart. If you want to face him, I'll be right there with you. If you'd rather not, that's okay too." After a moment's consideration, Rachel nodded. "I want to go," she said, her voice small but determined. "I want him to know he can't scare me anymore." Pride swelled in John's chest at his daughter's bravery. They followed Principal Harris through the now empty hallways, the sound of their footsteps echoing ominously. As they approached Mr. Fletcher's classroom, John felt Rachel tense beside him. He put a protective arm around her shoulders, silently communicating his support. Principal Harris knocked once before opening the door. Mr. Fletcher sat at his desk, his posture rigid, his face a mask of barely concealed anger. As they entered, his eyes flickered between Rachel and John, a hint of something, fear, defiance in his gaze. "Mr. Fletcher," Principal Harris began, her tone professional but cold, "Rachel and her father are here to discuss the incidents she's reported. I believe you owe them an explanation." Mr. Fletcher's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing. For a moment, John thought he might deny everything, but then, to everyone's shock, a smirk spread across the teacher's face. "An explanation?" Mr. Fletcher scoffed, his voice dripping with disdain. "Fine. Here's your explanation. I was just keeping order in my class. Some students," his eyes flicked to Rachel, "need to learn their place." The blatant racism in his words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. John felt Rachel flinch beside him, and something inside him snapped. "Their place?" he growled, taking a step forward. "And what place is that, Mr. Fletcher?" The teacher's smirk didn't waver. "This is a respectable school, Mr. Dawson. We have standards to maintain. Certain students," again his gaze lingered on Rachel, "disrupt those standards by their very presence." John's vision went red. He opened his mouth, ready to unleash a torrent of anger, but Rachel's quiet voice cut through the tension like a knife. "You're wrong," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "I belong here just as much as anyone else. My skin color doesn't change that." Mr. Fletcher's face contorted with anger. "You little—" "That's enough," Principal Harris interrupted, her voice sharp. "Mr. Fletcher, you are suspended effective immediately. Please leave the premises now. We'll be in touch regarding further action." Mr. Fletcher's face twisted into a sneer, but he made no move to leave. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, a look of smug defiance on his face. "You can't do that," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "I have tenure. I know my rights." John felt his anger reach a boiling point. The casual arrogance, the utter lack of remorse. It was too much. Before he could stop himself, he was reaching for his phone. "Rights?" John spat, his fingers flying over the keypad. "Let's talk about rights. Let's talk about my daughter's right to an education free from discrimination and harassment. Let's talk about the rights of every student in this school to feel safe and respected." Mr. Fletcher's smug expression faltered slightly as he watched John dial a number. "What are you doing?" he demanded, a note of uncertainty creeping into his voice. John met his gaze unflinchingly. "I'm calling the police," he said, his voice steady and resolute. "What you've done isn't just morally reprehensible, Mr. Fletcher. It's illegal." The color drained from Mr. Fletcher's face as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Principal Harris, who had been watching the exchange with a mixture of shock and approval, nodded firmly. "Mr. Fletcher," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument, "I suggest you wait outside my office until the authorities arrive. This is no longer just a school matter." As Mr. Fletcher was led away, his earlier bravado replaced by stunned silence, John turned to Rachel. His daughter stood tall, her eyes shining with unshed tears, but her chin held high. "You okay, sweetheart?" he asked softly, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Rachel nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Yeah, Dad," she said. "I think I am." As they waited for the police to arrive, John felt a complex mix of emotions washing over him. There was anger, of course, a deep simmering rage at the injustice his daughter had faced. But there was also pride in Rachel's strength and courage, in her ability to stand up for herself in the face of such blatant discrimination. And underneath it all, there was a sense of relief. The truth was out now. The silence had been broken. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as a family. The arrival of the police brought a surreal quality to the already tense atmosphere of Somerton High School. Officers Miller and Johnson, their uniforms crisp and their expressions professionally neutral, stood in Principal Harris's office, notepads at the ready. John sat beside Rachel, his hand resting supportively on her shoulder as she recounted her experiences to the officers. He marveled at her composure, the steady cadence of her voice as she detailed weeks of subtle discrimination and overt racism. "And then today," Rachel continued, her voice only wavering slightly, "during the presentation, Mr. Fletcher made a comment about the white chalk being helpful for me in other ways. The whole class laughed. That's when I couldn't take it anymore and ran out." Officer Miller nodded sympathetically, jotting down notes. "That must have been very difficult for you," she said gently. "Can you think of any other specific incidents or comments Mr. Fletcher made?" As Rachel continued to speak, providing dates and details with a clarity that made John's heart swell with pride, he noticed Officer Johnson's expression growing increasingly grave. The officer's eyes met John's briefly, a silent acknowledgement of the seriousness of the situation passing between them. When Rachel finished her account, Officer Miller turned to John. Mr. Dawson, when did you first become aware of these incidents? John felt a pang of guilt as he answered, I knew something was wrong for the past few weeks. Rachel was coming home upset, withdrawing from activities she usually enjoyed, but I didn't know the full extent of what was happening until today. He went on to recount his late-night call to Mr. Fletcher and the teacher's dismissive response, watching as the officers exchanged significant looks. Principal Harris, who had been listening silently, spoke up. I want to assure you both that the school takes these allegations very seriously. Mr. Fletcher has been suspended pending a full investigation. Officer Johnson nodded, his pen poised over his notepad. And where is Mr. Fletcher now? He's waiting in a conference room down the hall, Principal Harris replied. We thought it best to keep him separated until you arrived. The officers exchanged a glance before Officer Miller stood. We'll need to speak with Mr. Fletcher now. Mr. Dawson, Rachel, thank you for your statements. We may need to follow up with you for additional information as we proceed with our investigation. As the officers left to interview Mr. Fletcher, John turned to Rachel. You did great, sweetheart, he said softly. I'm so proud of you. Rachel managed a small smile, the tension she'd been holding finally starting to ease. Thanks, Dad, she whispered. I'm glad it's over. But John knew it was far from over. This was just the beginning of what would likely be a long and challenging process. Yet looking at Rachel's face, seeing the relief in her eyes at finally having her story heard and believed, he knew it was worth it. The next hour passed in a blur of activity. John and Rachel watched as Mr. Fletcher was led out of the school in handcuffs, his earlier arrogance replaced by a pale, shocked expression. Other students, drawn by the commotion, gathered in the hallways, whispering and pointing. As word spread about what had happened, several students approached the principal's office. To John's surprise and Rachel's visible relief, they came forward as witnesses, corroborating Rachel's account of Mr. Fletcher's behavior. He always singled Rachel out, one girl said, her voice shaking slightly. We should have said something sooner. We're sorry, Rachel. Rachel's eyes welled with tears, but this time they were tears of relief and gratitude. Thank you, she said softly. It means a lot to hear that. As the day drew to a close, John and Rachel found themselves back in Principal Harris's office. The principal looked exhausted, but determined as she addressed them. I want to thank you both for your courage in coming forward, she said. I assure you, we will be taking immediate steps to address this situation and prevent anything like it from happening again. John nodded, his arm around Rachel's shoulders. We appreciate that, he said, but I hope you understand that we'll be watching closely to ensure those steps are taken. Principal Harris nodded solemnly. Of course, we welcome your involvement, Mr. Dawson. This is an opportunity for our school to do better, to be better. As they drove home, both lost in thought about the events of the day and the challenges that lay ahead, John couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. They had broken the silence, shattered the walls of fear and isolation that had been building around Rachel. Whatever came next, they would face it as a family, stronger and more united than ever before. The weeks following the confrontation at Somerton High School passed in a whirlwind of activity for the Dawson family. John, true to his word, threw himself fully into the fight for justice, determined to see Mr. Fletcher face the consequences of his actions. The family's dining room table became a makeshift war room, covered in legal documents, newspaper clippings, and notebooks filled with scribbled timelines and witness statements. John and Marie spent long nights poring over every detail, determined to build an airtight case. Rachel, for her part, showed a strength and resilience that continually amazed her parents. Despite the trauma she had endured, she insisted on being involved in every step of the process, her voice growing stronger and more confident with each retelling of her story. As news of the incident spread, other families came forward with their own stories of discrimination at the hands of Mr. Fletcher. What had started as one family's fight for justice was rapidly evolving into a movement for change within the entire school district. The day of the first court hearing arrived on a crisp autumn morning. The Dawson family stood on the courthouse steps, a united front facing a sea of reporters and concerned community members. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Mr. Fletcher sat at the defense table, his earlier arrogance replaced by a look of grim resignation. His lawyer, a sharp-suited woman with a reputation for aggressive defense tactics, eyed the prosecution team warily. As the proceedings began, John squeezed Rachel's hand reassuringly. The prosecutor, a no-nonsense woman named Sarah Lindholm, laid out the case against Mr. Fletcher in clear, uncompromising terms. "Your Honor," she began, her voice ringing out in the hushed courtroom, "the evidence we will present today will show a clear pattern of discriminatory behavior and emotional abuse perpetrated by Mr. Fletcher against Rachel Dawson and other students of color at Somerton High School." Mr. Fletcher's lawyer tried to argue that her client's actions were merely strict disciplinary measures, not racially motivated. But as witness after witness took the stand, recounting incidents of subtle and overt racism, her arguments began to crumble. Rachel's testimony was the turning point. As she spoke, her voice clear and unwavering, John felt a surge of pride so strong it brought tears to his eyes. This was his daughter, standing tall and speaking her truth, refusing to be silenced or intimidated. "Mr. Fletcher made me feel like I didn't belong," Rachel said, her gaze steady as she addressed the court. "Like my presence in the classroom was somehow wrong or disruptive. But I know now that he was wrong. I have every right to be there, to learn and grow just like any other student." As Rachel stepped down from the witness stand, a murmur ran through the courtroom. Even Mr. Fletcher seemed shaken, the gravity of his actions finally seeming to sink in. The defense's case, when presented, felt weak in comparison. Mr. Fletcher took the stand, attempting to paint himself as a strict but fair teacher who had been misunderstood. But under the skilled cross-examination of the prosecutor, his excuses fell apart. "Mr. Fletcher," Sarah Lindholm asked, her voice sharp, "can you explain why you felt it necessary to single out Rachel and other students of color for what you claim was additional discipline?" Mr. Fletcher stuttered, his composure cracking. I was just trying to maintain order in my classroom," he said weakly. "And did you feel that students of color were inherently more disruptive?" the prosecutor pressed. The silence that followed was damning. As the trial drew to a close, John felt a mix of exhaustion and anticipation. They had presented their case, laid bare the ugly truth of what had happened at Somerton High. Now it was up to the judge to decide. The courtroom was packed on the day of the verdict. John sat with his arm around Rachel, Marie on her other side, as they waited for the judge to enter. "All rise," the bailiff called out, and a hush fell over the room. The judge, a stern-faced woman with graying hair, took her seat and surveyed the courtroom. "In the matter of Dawson versus Fletcher," she began, her voice steady and clear, "this court finds the defendant, Mr. Fletcher, guilty of emotional abuse and discrimination." A collective gasp went up from the assembled crowd. John felt Rachel stiffen beside him, then relax, as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "Mr. Fletcher," the judge continued, "your actions have caused significant harm to Rachel Dawson and other students under your care. This court orders you to pay $50,000 in damages to the Dawson family. Furthermore, you are sentenced to 1 year in prison for your actions." As the judge's gavel came down, finalizing the verdict, John pulled Rachel into a tight hug. "It's over," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You did it, sweetheart. You stood up for yourself and made a difference." Rachel nodded, tears streaming down her face. "We did it, Dad," she corrected him. "We did it together." As they left the courthouse, stepping out into the bright sunlight, John knew that this was both an ending and a beginning. They had won their battle, but the war against discrimination and prejudice was far from over. Looking at Rachel, seeing the strength and determination in her eyes, John felt a renewed sense of purpose. They had broken the silence, and in doing so had paved the way for change. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, their voices raised in unity against injustice. The months following the trial were a time of healing and transformation for the Dawson family and the entire Somerton community. The case had shone a spotlight on the insidious nature of racial discrimination in education, sparking conversations and inspiring change far beyond the walls of Somerton High School. For Rachel, the journey of recovery was both challenging and empowering. There were days when the memory of Mr. Fletcher's treatment still stung, when the echo of her classmates' laughter at his racist jokes seemed to ring in her ears. But there were also days of triumph, of realizing her own strength and the power of her voice. John and Marie worked tirelessly to support their daughter, arranging for counseling sessions and creating a safe, nurturing environment at home. They listened when Rachel needed to talk, held her when she needed to cry, and celebrated every small victory in her healing process. At Somerton High, the changes were swift and significant. Principal Harris, true to her word, implemented a comprehensive diversity and inclusion training program for all staff members. The school board, under pressure from parents and community activists, adopted new policies to prevent and address racial discrimination. But perhaps the most significant change came in the form of Ms. Amelia Carter, the new teacher hired to replace Mr. Fletcher. A young, enthusiastic woman of color, Ms. Carter brought a fresh perspective and a deep commitment to inclusive education to Somerton High. Rachel's first day back at school after the trial was filled with anxiety. John insisted on driving her, wanting to ensure she felt safe and supported. As they pulled up to the school, Rachel took a deep breath, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "You okay, sweetheart?" John asked, his voice gentle. Rachel nodded, a determined look in her eyes. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady despite the slight tremor in her hands. As they walked into the school, John noticed the changes immediately. New posters adorned the walls, promoting diversity and inclusion. Students and teachers alike greeted Rachel warmly, many offering words of support and admiration for her bravery. At the door of Rachel's new classroom, they were met by Ms. Carter. Her warm smile and kind eyes immediately put Rachel at ease. "Welcome back, Rachel," Ms. Carter said, extending her hand. "I'm so glad to have you in my class. We have a lot of exciting things planned this semester." As Rachel entered the classroom, John felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The atmosphere was entirely different from what Rachel had described under Mr. Fletcher's tenure. Students of all backgrounds sat together, engaged in animated discussions. The walls were adorned with diverse artwork and inspirational quotes from leaders of various ethnicities. John watched as Rachel took her seat, her posture relaxed, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. For the first time in months, she looked truly comfortable in a classroom setting. As he turned to leave, Ms. Carter caught his arm. "Mr. Dawson," she said softly, "I want you to know that what you and Rachel did, it's made a real difference here. We're committed to making sure nothing like that ever happens again." John nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. "Thank you," he managed to say. "That means a lot." As the weeks passed, John watched Rachel flourish. She threw herself into her studies with renewed enthusiasm, joining clubs and participating in class discussions. The spark that had dimmed under Mr. Fletcher's oppressive treatment blazed brightly once more. At home, family dinners once again became a time of lively conversation and laughter. Rachel regaled them with stories of her day, her eyes shining as she described interesting lessons or funny incidents with her friends. As John listened to his daughter's animated chatter, he felt a profound sense of gratitude and hope. They had weathered a storm together and emerged stronger for it. The silence that had once threatened to tear them apart had been broken, replaced by open communication and unwavering support. Looking at Rachel, her face alight with enthusiasm as she talked about her future plans, John knew that they had not just overcome a challenge, they had set the stage for lasting change. Their story, born from adversity but shaped by courage and resilience, would continue to inspire others to speak up and stand against injustice. The Dawson family had found their voice, and they would never be silenced again. As they moved forward, they carried with them the knowledge that their experience, though painful, had paved the way for a more inclusive and equitable future, not just for Rachel, but for all those who would come after her.